I'm really pleased to be here with you this morning and to have this opportunity to introduce to you our guest speaker, Ambassador Dennis Ross, and our moderator, Mr. PJ Crowley. This morning's discussion is one of the great importance to the U.S., the region, and the world. This is especially true in the light of the current situation in Syria and the ever-present potential dangers in the region. This keynote plenary discussion is intended to address the key elements of the challenge that a nuclear Iran presents to our key ally, Israel, our larger strategic interest, and global security, as well as to assess the options for U.S. policy. It will also focus on the implications of Iran's nuclear program regarding the Middle East peace process and evaluate the prospects for a peace process in the Middle East post-U.S. election. With this in mind, it is a privilege for me to introduce one of the most important players in American foreign policy of the past generation, who is certainly familiar, to say the least, with these issues in the region. Ambassador Ross, the Washington Institute for Near Middle East Policy's Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and Counselor from 2001 to 2009, rejoined the Institute as counselor in December 2011, after serving 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama, as well as National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as a Special Advisor to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, focusing on Iran. He has played a central figure in American diplomacy on the Arab-Israelite conflict since the administration of George H.W. Bush, and has also served brilliantly in the Clinton administration. For more than 12 years, he has played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process and dealing directly with those parties, with the parties in those negotiations. Some of the most important accomplishments of American diplomacy occurred under the direction of Ambassador Ross, such as the Madrid Peace Conference in the early 90s, the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty in the mid-90s, and the brokering of the 1997 Hebron Accord. A scholar and diplomat with more than 2 decades of experience in Soviet and Middle East policy, Ambassador Ross worked closely with the Secretaries of State James Baker, Warren Christopher, and Madeleine Albright. We certainly look forward to his remarks this morning. Our moderator has also had a distinguished career in foreign and national security policy. Mr. Crowley is a 2011-2012 Omar Bradley Chair of Strategic Leadership, which is a joint effort among the United States War College, Dickinson College, and Penn State Law to advance the study of strategic leadership and enhance civilian-military dialogue by offering distinguished individuals the opportunity to contribute to the educational and research activities of the three institutions. President Obama nominated him to the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs in the U.S. Department of State in 2009. Previously, he served as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Public Affairs for the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. Before joining the State Department, Crowley was a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress, with a particular focus on homeland security and combating terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, we could not ask for more distinguished and esteemed speaker and moderator who are familiar with these very challenges and opportunities in the region, and we look forward to their discussion and remarks. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ross, Mr. PJ Crowley.
Thank you very much. Dennis and I have done this a lot over the years, never before an audience. When you're the president's foreign policy spokesman and you're hanging out in the Roosevelt room as you have the Israeli prime minister and then Chairman Arafat and the president trying to reach Middle East peace, you go to Dennis and go, okay, what do we tell the press? And he said, well, you can tell them whatever you want except for this, this, and this. Well, then what else is there? But now we've got the Dennis who's out of government.
And PJ who's out of government.
and writing a new book. But when you think about the next 4 years, clearly how the United States relationship evolves with Iran, whether the nuclear issue can be resolved short of conflict, will be among those, if not the most pivotal issue facing the president in his second term. I thought, Dennis, to start off, in 2009, when you were at the State Department as the special envoy for Iran, there was a strategy of both engagement and pressure. Go back to 2009, the engagement has continued at a certain level through the P5+1 process, but then there has been a focus over the last couple of years on pressure, sanctions, and clearly the 40% drop in value of the Iranian currency shows that that actually is having a desired effect. But now has the pressure of the last couple of years actually created the opportunity for return to diplomacy here in the forthcoming weeks and months?
Okay, I'm going to start by trying to break my mindset, because normally when I sit with PJ, I'm sitting here saying, you can talk about context, you just can't give away anything. And he would say, well, can't I say this much? And I said, well, if you do, I'll kill you. But other than that, it'll be no problem. So today I will try to reorient myself and see ourselves in this different kind of setting. It is to remind me, by going back to 2009, we would sit together and we would talk about, all right, what can we say? And now, actually, in retrospect, the essence of the strategy has unfolded in many respects as I think we probably anticipated. There was never an assumption that when the president was talking about engagement was going to be a panacea. We would have meetings with the Iranians. We would quickly begin singing Kumbaya, and everything would be transformed. But there was an assumption from the beginning that engagement was a two-headed coin. One side of it reflected the reality that we have not had a systematic ability to talk to the Iranians on basically anything. We've had episodic encounters with them over the years since 1979, but nothing ever systematic. And the idea was we wanted to use engagement first to test the possibility, was there an ability to reach an understanding with them? And the thought was, when you've had for over 30 years others defining us to them and them to us, always having others interpreting our respective views and perceptions to each other, you needed to see if you could actually have a conversation, and a conversation that could allow you to both talk to each other and explain your respective views, where you saw threats, why you saw threats, what in their behaviors were problematic, listen to what they had to say about us, and be prepared to sort of outline to them, look, you have rights, but you also have responsibilities. You seem to want your rights when it comes to the NPT, you just don't want any of your responsibilities under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You want your rights recognized in the region, but you also want to be able to threaten all your neighbors. So you don't just get to have rights, you have to have responsibilities, and that was going to be part of what we were to say to them if we had the chance to talk to them. So one element of engagement was quite genuine, just to sort of, let's see if we can actually talk. But there was another side to engagement, and that was the Obama administration inherited from the Bush administration, fairly or not, a perception that the United States was so reluctant to talk to the Iranians that was a source of the problem, not Iran's behavior. And we needed to demonstrate unmistakably that, look, we're prepared to deal with them. And if there's a problem, it's not because we're reluctant to talk to them, it's because of their behavior. So engagement always had within it the seeds of being able to mobilize the rest of the world to put pressure on the Iranians, particularly if they weren't responsive. And the truth is, they weren't willing to engage, and secondly, when there have been times of engagement, basically not bilaterally, because they were really only willing to engage under the umbrella of the 5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, with us. In that context, they have not been responsive either. So we put ourselves in a position where being willing to engage allowed us to then also focus on building pressure on them. And there was an assumption that the notion of dual track could work, at least in terms of pressure, because if you look at the behavior of the Islamic Republic since 1979, the only times they've adjusted their behavior has been when they have been under great pressure and paid a great price as they measured it. In 1988, after the Supreme Leader, Khomeini, had declared that Iran would fight the war with Iraq for 20 years or however long it took, when the Revolutionary Guard, the leaders of the Revolutionary Guard, and Mousavi, who's now under house arrest, who was then the Prime Minister, came to him and said, we don't have the forces, we don't have the money, the Americans are reflagging tankers, and they've now shot down a civilian airliner, and we could be getting into more of a conflict with them, and we can't afford it. We got to end this war and the supreme leader had said 20 years or forever we'll fight this, suddenly decided he would end the war and described ending the war as being the equivalent of drinking poison from a chalice. He didn't want to do it, but he did it. In 2003, after we defeated the Iraqi army in 3 weeks, an army they couldn't defeat in 8.5 years and basically had to sue for peace with, suddenly they decided and they thought they were next, suddenly they decided that they would suspend enrichment and even put a proposal on the table which would have actually indicated a readiness to end their military support for Hezbollah and Hamas and turn it only into political support. Unfortunately, that proposal they put on the table wasn't really pursued. We can get into why it wasn't pursued in 2003. It's a separate issue, but the fact is it wasn't pursued. But these two examples are indications that with the right kind of pressures, their behavior will change. Now, as you said, PJ, there's no doubt we have succeeded in putting on them crippling sanctions. In 2009, we talked about biting sanctions because we had to change the dynamic. We've gotten to the point where we're able to work with the rest of the world and mobilize the rest of the world to put crippling sanctions on them. And by the way, the estimates right now are every 2 months their currency is being devalued by half. Every 2 months. Now think about what that means. It means that whatever they're buying costs them twice as much. It means whatever they have in the bank is valued at half as much. The manifestations of the effect this is having within society are not hard to come by. You had demonstrations during the most recent Ramadan because there was a shortage of chicken. Not typically a demonstration during Ramadan. 3 weeks ago, you had demonstrations in the bazaar. Again, by the merchant class, who, by the way, were the linchpin of the revolution of 1979. You have the supreme leader in the last 2 weeks making 2 separate statements where he described sanctions as being, in his words, brutal. And this is the same guy who said since 1979, we've always been sanctioned. Sanctions make us stronger. We become more self-sufficient. We're better off. And suddenly, even though his tone of defiance towards us didn't change, suddenly he's talking about the sanctions being brutal, and he's using the words economic warfare, not what he used before. And in the last 2 weeks, he has repeatedly called on the leading Iranian officials to stop fighting each other. By the way, the head of the Revolutionary Guard has attacked the head of the central bank. Think about that. The head of the Revolutionary Guard has criticized the head of the central bank for causing the currency problem. Why is the head of the Revolutionary Guard suddenly commenting on the head of the central bank? Well, one of the reasons is because they're feeling it too. They have, going back to Rafsanjani, former president, who helped to embed the Revolutionary Guard in their economy as a way of creating an enduring loyalty, suddenly they're feeling it too. And so the internal bickering, which the Supreme Leader is calling on everyone to stop, is a function of the pressure. So that's the good news. By the way, I always say, when I get home and I say to my wife, I've got good news and bad news. For some reason, she always asks for the bad news first. But with you, I'm giving you the good news first. Now I'm giving you the bad news. The bad news is their nuclear program hasn't changed. Now, I think what this means is that we're heading towards a year that is going to be decisive. In 2013 will be decisive one way or the other. I believe the administration will pursue a new diplomatic initiative, meaning one that is geared towards something I've been for a while, which is putting an endgame proposal on the table which would allow the Iranians to have civil nuclear power, but with restrictions that would prevent them from being able to break out to a nuclear warhead capability. If you go back to the last debate between the President and Governor Romney, the President actually not only said, as long as I'm President, they're not going to have nuclear weapons, but he actually began to define the concept of prevention because he said, we won't permit them to have a breakout capacity. If you look at where we are, by the end of 2013, given the pace of their program, we are not really going to be in a position any longer to know, unless their program changes between now and then, whether they could present the war with a fait accompli. So the combination of the pressures they're under, which they're feeling, and the reality of the pace of the nuclear program and our objective of prevention makes sometime in the coming year, this is likely to reach a head. I do believe there's a diplomatic way out because I think the pressure is being felt by them. One last point on the pressure. The Ministry of Intelligence on their website this week actually put out an analysis, highly unusual, in which they talked about, well, they described what would happen if force was used against Iran. And on the one hand, saying, well, it only set us back a few years, but then it said diplomacy could achieve our aims at a much lower price. This is from them. You would never, and from the Ministry of Intelligence, this is something you would never have seen before. So these, for me, are straws in the wind that the pressure is having an effect. It's clearly having an effect, but straws in the wind that they are probably beginning to position themselves to justify a different kind of negotiation with us. Now, whether that's going to be sufficient to reach an agreement, that remains to be seen. But we can get into that discussion.
Now, you have a number of things coming up. The Iranians, there was the New York Times story right before the foreign policy debate that hinted that there was a dance underway to get to that new diplomatic initiative. But the Iranians were going to wait until the election. Now they know who the president is. We have an Israeli election in January. We have an Iranian election in June. How might those influence not only the direction of the diplomatic initiative, but the pace? How long will this take?
I'm absolutely glad we're both out so I can answer these kinds of questions. He used to ask these kinds of questions when we were on the inside. And, of course, I couldn't say anything about this. So this is a very different kind of setting for us.
Finally.
Well, let's take each of these in turn. The Iranian election creates what I would describe as both an opportunity and a problem. Because before their election, you're likely to see increasing turmoil within the leadership. It tells me there's probably a fairly short window before they get into that vote. I do believe, by the way, some of the maneuvering right now is even in anticipation on their side that they're going to have to do something soon before they get into their own election cycle. And their elections aren't like ours necessarily, but we've seen that they get consumed. First of all, they define who can run. And most of the people who could be candidates are disqualified from being these candidates, not permitted to be candidates. But even within, we saw it in 2009, even within the context of a fairly confined room for who could be candidates, there ended up being this kind of remarkable tussle that went on, and it was also, in many respects, completely preoccupying to them. It'll be very interesting to see who emerges as the candidates, but I think the first point is simply to note, I think there's probably a window of a couple of months, probably not to exceed, I would say, probably through February. After that, given the elections in June, I suspect we may get caught up, they may get caught up, and it's all maneuvering, and the Supreme Leader is going to have to decide what he wants to do. But I would note one other thing, just in passing. One thing about the Supreme Leader, he basically preserved Ahmadinejad in power, and then it was one of these things, be careful what you wish for, because this guy became kind of his worst nightmare. And the last thing he wants is for there to be a deal with the United States that Ahmadinejad would get credit for. Now, by the same token, he probably wants to do something in advance of their election, because if there's a new president and he's elected and he gets credit for it, then that president becomes popular, and that becomes also a threat to the Supreme Leader. If you look historically, there has been tension between every Iranian president and the Supreme Leader, at least since Khamenei became the Supreme Leader. So you're talking about the last 20 years. So that's why I say that creates a kind of interesting window. Now, there's an Israeli election on January 22nd, and I think, what you saw, the Prime Minister of Israel, when he gave his speech at the UN, and he had this graphic illustration of the problem, he created what was a new threshold for them. He called it a red line, but a new threshold. They had, for the previous, 6 to 12 months, the Israelis had been focusing on, primarily because of the defense minister, Barak, on what he called a zone of immunity. What he meant by a zone of immunity was Iran was going to, with the character of its nuclear program, the depth, the breadth, the redundancy, the hardening of the nuclear program, was going to reach a point where the Israelis would actually lose their military option. And no Israeli prime minister, not just this one, no Israeli prime minister is going to easily accept a situation where they face an existential threat, but they no longer have a military option to deal with it. And so Ehud Barak was trying to identify the point at which the zone of immunity was going to kick in. Now, he was saying it was going to be the end of 2012. Now, he's changed that and said it's been pushed back 8 to 10 months. When the Prime Minister was in New York, he focused not on the zone of immunity, he focused on what's the point at which the Iranians would cross a threshold where they would have the ability to build a nuclear weapon and you wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And he was suggesting, that would be when they have one bomb's worth of 20%. By the way, that's a very limited definition because, let's say the Iranians decide, okay, we're not going to do, we'll agree to limits below 20%, but if they can continue to build 20 bombs worth of 3.5%, they're going to reach the same point. So the issue for him was defined in a way that also pushed it off into the middle of 2013. So both the defense minister and the prime minister, from different perspectives, have come up with a time frame that is close to the middle of 2013. Here again, I say that because I think it creates, you see, an interesting kind of convergence where there's a window of, I would say, the next 3 to 4 months to try to do something. Now, the question is, if you get into a negotiation, if it's an endgame kind of negotiation, this allows you to, I think, clarify whether this is actually going to be real or not.
So I want to ask one more question of Dennis, but if people want to ask questions, why don't you start to move towards the microphones in the front and back. But yesterday, Zvigu Brzezinski at the Aspen Institute suggested that a preemptive military strike to take out Iran's existing military capability was not a credible option because it starts a conflict without necessarily understanding where it ends. It was very clear that the military remains an option, but he would say it has to be where Iran acts first to try to break out of sanctions, and if so, then there's much more strong, justifiable, and greater regional support, to retaliate. How do you see the role of military force in this? And beyond that, the president had said that containment is not his policy, and yet you, in your days as a Soviet expert, understood that containment works just fine. If diplomacy fails, and the military option may be necessary but carries tremendous costs and uncertainty, is containment a viable option with regard to?
Well, there was. Let's take that issue on directly, and that I can deal with also what Brzezinski said. There was a debate within the administration before the president adopted the objective of prevention. And the debate was between two options. Should we have an objective of prevention or should we have an objective of containment? Those who argued for containment didn't say, look, Iran having a nuclear weapon is a good thing, but what they said is, we can live with it, and we can contain it, we can deter them. And we can do it because, we've done it with Pakistan went nuclear, and
North
Korea's gone nuclear, and before, if you go back to the Kennedy administration contemplated a preemptive strike against the Chinese and even talked to the Soviets about the possibility of cooperating in this because of the concern of what it meant if China actually had this capability. So those who argued for containment said, look, we've been able to contain others, why can't it work here? And the argument against containment was because it won't work. And here's the essence of what the argument was. It wasn't that if they have a nuclear weapon, the moment they get a nuclear weapon, they're going to use it. It wasn't that. Look, they want nuclear weapons for offensive and defensive purposes. The Iranians believe they have the right to dominate the Middle East. This is their self-perception. They think we're this long historical culture. They look down on the Arabs. They think that they have the right to dominate the region. And they see the nuclear weapons as making them much more likely to be a hegemon. It's also a defensive reason they want it, because they say, North Korea's got it. Nobody, in a sense, is threatening them the same way.
They're crazy, but not stupid.
Right. And Gaddafi gave his up, and look what happened to him. So they have offensive and defensive reasons. So the argument was not that the minute they get it, they're going to use it. And the argument wasn't that the minute they get it, they'll immediately turn it over to Hezbollah, although there is some risk over time because they have turned over a lot of things to Hezbollah. But the argument was different. The argument was it won't work for the following reason. The Obama administration would be the third administration that has said they can't have it. The administration we worked in, the Clinton administration, said they can't have it. The George W. Bush administration said they can't have it. And then the Obama administration said they can't have it. So after they get it, after having had three administrations say they can't have it, if we then go to Iran's neighbors, like, for example, the Saudis, and say, it's okay, we said they couldn't have it, they got it, but you can take our assurance, and we'll extend our nuclear umbrella to you. You don't need to get it. Well, that's not going to be a very credible argument to them, to say the least. And I have my own personal experience, because in the spring of 2009, I was asked to go see the King of Saudi Arabia and explain our Iranian policy to him, and I spent about an hour going through all the intricacies of this and being eloquent and the like. And at the end of an hour of my doing this, he says, very simply, if they get it, we get it. Now, of course, I then am duty-bound to explain to him the consequences of that. So for the next 10 minutes, in a very compelling way, I explain all the consequences of this because I'm duty-bound. At the end of 10 minutes, he says, if they get it, we get it. So much for my persuasive capabilities, but there's a reason. It's not only that I was just saying if they were to get it, everything we said before would be taken seriously by the regional players, but your Saudi Arabia, your most serious competitor is Iran in every conceivable sense, geopolitically in the region, religiously, psychologically, and suddenly Iran now has this unmistakable image of superiority over you. That's simply not something they're going to tolerate. And it doesn't matter what we say to them. So once the Iranians get it, the Saudis will get it. And people say, well, they don't have the nuclear infrastructure, they have something else. They have money. And they will be able to get it from, let's say, Pakistan. Oftentimes we do these things as in echo form. So they will have it. Now, once they have it, and this was the second part of the argument. So containment won't prevent that. Now you're talking about a Middle East that's going to be nuclear armed, and it won't only be the Saudis. And the idea that the concepts of the Cold War, of which I was a practitioner of, are going to work here. I used to work on the Soviet Union. I actually started off as an arms control negotiator. There you had mutual assured destruction. You had a guaranteed balance of terror because each side knew they couldn't disarm the other. We both had an assured second strike capability. In the Middle East, you won't have that. No one will believe they can afford to strike second. Now it means that everybody in that region is going to be on a hair trigger. Now think about it. This is a region that's characterized by conflict. That's the norm. That's not the exception. So they're all on a hair trigger, and it makes the prospect of a nuclear war very likely, which is a pretty horrendous prospect to have to contemplate. So that's the reason the president made the decision for prevention, not containment. Now, to pick up on the rest of the question, nobody looks at the use of force as being something you want to do. But the fact is, do I believe we'd have to wait until the Iranians did something? I believe, look, this president gave an interview where he said, I don't bluff. He also, many things about the president, he's not impulsive. He thinks things through. When this debate took place and he thought about it, he thought it through and he made a decision. All right, prevention is our objective. Now, one of the reasons I believe he will, at some point, we will see a serious effort to put an endgame proposal on the table that, in effect, will say to the Iranians, you say you want civil nuclear power, you can have it. But you have it with restrictions. Now, if they turn it down, I think that exposes them before the world, and that creates a justification to use force. And I think that's one of the reasons you'd also see that. So I'm not in the same place where Virginia is.
Questions from the floor?
Jay Brunch from the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. My question has to do with the violence that goes on between Israel and Iran today, and Iran and the U.S. to a certain extent. And I'm wondering how that, what would it take to have that create real problems that may lead to larger war. And I'm talking about the tit-for-tat assassinations, including the assassination attempt on the Saudi ambassador here. And I'm talking about the cyber war, U.S.-Israel apparently toward Iran, and Iran apparently now toward the U.S.
Well, there's certain things I'll address and certain things I won't address. Let me answer your question the following way. First, the kind of subterranean war between the Iranians and the Israelis has gone on for some time. In the 1990s, when I was our negotiator on the Arab-Israeli issue, we were constantly contending with acts of terror, and we knew they were being pushed and promoted by the Iranians. The Iranians were pushing particularly Palestinian Islamic Jihad to do this, and they were constantly demanding them to carry out bombings in Israel designed to undercut the negotiating process. And one of the things that bedeviled us and made it profoundly difficult was every time we seemed to make progress, we'd face a bombing. This is what the Iranians were doing, and we, at the time, I recall before the 1996 election in Israel, we actually went to the Germans, to say, look, you have a relationship with these guys. You've got to put pressure on them to get them to stop this. At that time, we were actually trying to push for much more severe sanctions because of what the Iranians were doing on the terror front, not so much even the nuclear front, but the terror front. So this has existed for some time. Now, there's obviously a built-in risk when you carry out. They do things towards the Israelis, and the Israelis don't admit to some of the, what we described as the assassinations. But the fact is, one of these actions can be taken that crosses the threshold with one side or the other, and you can't know for sure what's going to happen as a result. But the fact that it's gone on for a while suggests that each side seems to stay within certain kinds of bounds. So I think the nuclear question is really something different.
Thank you. With the acuteness of the Iran issue on the rise in recent years, my name is Ilya Lazowski. I'm here from Freedom House, but speaking entirely only for myself. With the acuteness of the Iran issue on the rise, I think that one other central problem that has been drowned out in recent years is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think one of the most depressing aspects of the foreign policy debate that happened was that it got barely mentioned. So I wanted to ask if you thought that this was an issue that would get any attention among U.S. policymakers in the next 4 years, and if more broadly, whether you think there are still any prospects for a two-state solution in the near future. Thanks.
Let me just add to that. I mean, there was a strong attempt in the first year of the Obama administration, to try to unlock it, and it was not successful. But I suppose another aspect of that is a peace agreement between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas, given their lack of trust and tension in that relationship. Can this happen between these two men, or does it have to wait until a leadership succession of one of them?
This is a difficult problem.
Full employment.
Yeah. Obviously, I've spent about the last 30 years of my life on this issue, and we've had moments where I thought we had tremendous potential to really achieve success, and obviously other moments that have been quite despairing. The one thing I'll say is, let's take a step back and I'll answer both PJ asked, but also what you asked as well. The context today for peacemaking is not great. And it's not great in no small part because the Arab awakening has created a chilling effect on both sides. For Abu Mazen, he looks at the rise of political Islam all around him and sees, gee, if he were to take a step towards the Israelis, there's bound to be a backlash against him. He gave an interview, just as an example of that, to Channel 2 of Israel a week ago in which he was asked a question about, would he return to his home in Sfat? He was born in Sfat, which is in Israel. And he said, no, he would not go back. And that was taken to mean that, in effect, he was giving up on the Palestinians the issue of the right of return. Now, for Israelis, the issue of the right of return means no Israel. If all Palestinians could return, there'd be no Israel. And for Palestinians, the right of return has been, of refugees, has been a kind of the guiding spirit of the national movement. It was what the PLO was built on. And obviously, this is an issue that you're going to have to resolve. And built into that has always been the assumption that they could return to their own state, not to Israel. There'd be some kind of compensation. When we did the parameters, that's effectively what we offered in the year 2000. And so when he said this, it produced an immediate backlash. And so then he gave another interview in Arabic, in which he said, well, he was speaking personally, no one can give up the right of return. And although I have to say, he gave an interesting answer, to be fair. Well, he said no one gave up the right of return. He basically referred to, look, this is in Resolution 194, UN General Assembly Resolution 194. And in his Arabic, he actually referred to how that refers to compensation. By the way, not to bore you, and unfortunately when someone's lived with this issue for as long as I have, there's sort of no issue that's too small. And there's like nothing that unfortunately I haven't been consumed by. 194 actually never uses the words right of return. It talks about those refugees who can return to their homes if they're prepared to live in peace. It never uses the term right of return. The right of return became something that was rather different. But anyway, I refer to this only because the context of the Arab awakening has a chilling effect on Abu Mazen, and we've seen it also in his behavior. He has not been, he has constantly come up with reasons why he couldn't be going into negotiations. Now, his rationale would be that he doesn't believe he could do it, there's negotiations possible with Netanyahu, and so he's wanted to focus on, he wanted Netanyahu to meet certain conditions, and if he met those conditions, that would improve negotiations that could lead somewhere. Netanyahu's view was, you insist on conditions with me that you insisted on with none of my predecessors. I'm prepared to talk without any preconditions. And this is what we fell victim to in the Obama administration. And there is a kind of, there's been a chilling effect on Netanyahu as well, Prime Minister Netanyahu as well, because you look around your neighborhood, and if you do a deal with Abu Mazen, he doesn't even control Gaza, number one, and how long is he going to be there? And what are you going to be facing? And so you need to be taking these risks. So each side has a reason not to take risks. But in my mind, believe it or not, that's not even the most important limitation today. The most important limitation today is that there's complete disbelief on the part of both publics. I'm using the word disbelief very consciously. There's complete disbelief on the part of both publics. Neither public believes that the other is committed to a two-state outcome. Israelis look at Palestinians and they believe the Palestinian public is still committed to a phased approach to doing away with Israel, or if they say two states, they mean a Palestinian state and a binational state. And Palestinians look at Israelis and they say they'll never surrender control. And if they really believed in two states, why are they building in what should be our state? So both of them have a story they tell themselves. I'm not just talking about leaders, I'm talking about publics. That the other side is not committed to a two-state outcome. Now, that's not an environment in which you're going to be able to say, gee, let's go put a plan on the table and it's likely to be accepted. Because if you put a plan on the table, both sides will reject it. And if you put a plan on the table, you put a plan on the table where the ideas you put on the table might be something that could work at a certain moment, but if they get rejected, it's hard then to somehow recreate it. So I will pause now. I actually do have a 14-point proposal, which will shock you. I actually do.
We are already
willing to get into it at some point.
Way over time, and Jonathan's signaling to me, but you've been very patient back. Maybe we'll get one last quick question and quick answer.
Thank you very much. My name is Vivian Palmer with the Las Vegas Council. My question is, if the administration decides that military action is our only exercisable option, have our other allies signaled or committed that they would support Israel in the U.S.? If so, who and what type of support can we expect?
Well, I don't think there's been those kinds of discussions because the focus has been on diplomacy on everybody's part. By the way, the concept of crippling sanctions is an Israeli concept, which also tells you that in the first instance, the Israelis believe that you can still achieve this through non-military means. And the Israelis, one of the reasons that I oftentimes get asked the question, why have the Israelis been so vocal about this? Because if you look at what they did in Osirak, which was the Iraqi reactor, and Al-Tabar, which was the Syrian one, which was they hit in 2006, you never heard word one about it before they did it. Why have they been so vocal about this? And I would say there's three reasons why they've been so vocal. One is that it was designed to motivate the rest of the world. And I think, by the way, if you know, we know from our efforts in this regard, the idea that the Europeans would have adopted the sanctions they did, including a boycott on Iranian oil, if they didn't think the alternative was that the Israelis would strike militarily, to think that would have happened without that Israeli, quote, motivation, probably not too realistic. So the motivation is real. The second reason they do it is because they're getting the world ready not to be surprised. If diplomacy fails, don't be surprised when we do it. And the third reason they do it is to get their own public ready. So that reflects their reality. But in answer to your question, we've not had conversations with others that I'm aware of that would deal with that. But I would note for you, David Cameron just made statements in which he said, also repeated the words that all options are on the table. He said, we want diplomacy to work, but all options are on the table. We're not the only ones who say all options are on the table. And I believe that what that reflects is, while diplomacy is, in fact, the most desired option, there are others who, if the context is created, and this is my point about an endgame proposal that demonstrates unmistakably the Iranians had a chance, had a diplomatic way out, and they chose not to take it. I think that would create a context where it becomes easier to use. My very last point, since I know we're over time, it is important to have that context to understand one thing. In 2007, the Iranians crossed the threshold where on their own they have the know-how and the engineering capability to do this on their own. So it means even if you destroy all the facilities, they can rebuild them. Now what you want is, if diplomacy fails, then you have to use force, and the force is targeted only against the nuclear program. It shouldn't be broader than that. You want to be able to maintain the same kinds of severe sanctions because that will raise the cost them dramatically of trying to rebuild. The more they know you create this kind of context, by the way, that is more likely to also have an effect on them in the first place, so the force itself doesn't become necessary.
Join me in thanking a good friend and great analyst, Dennis Ross.